To invite Dewayne Wilson up from Washington State DOT. He's going to talk about their concrete bridge deck preservation program.
Well, good afternoon. I just realized I'm in a bad spot. I'm between you and your break. But I have a kind of a overview of the Washington State DOT's bridge deck program. My particular role is asset management engineer in Washington State DOT. So I'm doing all of the bridge preservation. Preserving our concrete bridge decks is one component of that. We have some history there. Who remembers what happened on May 18th, 1980? Mount St. Helens. That was 37 years ago now. That's kind of dated where our bridge deck program was. Our first concrete overlay started in 1979, and then in the early 80s, mid 80s, we kind of got more into that. And so that's kind of giving you some ideas. We started off really well, and now we're in the kind of the management of bridge deck program. So that's kind of where I'm going to focus on. This gives you an idea of what our inventory looks like. Kind of like Colorado, we're 3,120 bridges over 20 feet, carry vehicular traffic with a replacement value of about 51 billion. This graph was kind of put together by people that do our gray notebook. It's kind of a little bit confusing, but it has a bar chart there that shows age of bridges plus replacement value kind of on the top there. Kind of a couple of things is our oldest bridge, state bridge, is 1910, average age 47. We currently have 8 bridges now. One of those we're sharing with Oregon, over 100 years old, and 241 bridges over 80 years old. So it kind of just gives you an indication our inventory is getting older. What does it look like? About 3/4 is concrete with 41% pre-stress and about 1/4 is steel. This is based on deck area. And then 9 out of 10 bridges right now are pre-stress girders. So this is kind of like the overall condition if you look at just the NBI deck code. So a slice of what's in pour right now is 107 bridges. This big yellow band on this donut is kind of concerning because at any point that some of those bridges in that yellow could fall into red. So you got 807 bridges right there that are in fair, and then the rest good. So bridge decks, you know, they come in a variety based on the design of a bridge. You could have a steel bridge, whether it's girder or truss or an arch, and then the pre-stress, regular precast units, slabs. And then I didn't throw up here is we even have timber bridges with concrete decks on them. So a whole variety based on the design of the bridge, and a lot of things go into that. But if we take a typical concrete bridge deck, there's some things that will deteriorate or cause issues in that bridge deck over time, whether it's just rebar corrosion, deterioration, rutting, rebar cover, and then poor quality concrete. So if you look at just deterioration, rebar corrosion, you know, that's kind of typical. That's probably the most common defect in our bridges. This one here is if you're ever driving back from eastern Washington coming over I-90, you would find this. You'd want to be in the far left lane because these 2 lanes on the right side aren't looking too good. Fortunately, we're going to fix this bridge this summer. So rutting is another issue. This is a good example of that. This bridge is out in Spokane, which is on the eastern side of Washington State, and it's in an area where they just love studded tires. So studded tires means rutting. And so on this particular bridge, we overlaid it about 30 years ago, which, you know, that's kind of the life of the overlay. Maintenance has kind of did these, you know, train track filling of the ruts in a couple places. And there's a little measurement there. At one time, wherever they took this measurement, it was 1.5 inch ruts. And then here's an aerial view of that. On one bridge, they covered the whole 1 lane. On the other bridge, they tried a couple of different ways of doing it, whether it's just filling in the ruts and partial. I was kind of curious, so I said, you know, is rutting this new phase or did it happen in the past? Well, in the Oregon Trail, if you want to go over to Wyoming, there's a place where ruts happened in rock. This was sandstone. So, you know, it's a common phenomenon. Just we switched a little bit to the future now. into the modern day vehicles we have. So typical, another thing would happen is maybe the bridge deck wasn't built quite right and we didn't get the rebar cover we needed, or rutting over time has exposed that rebar. And then finally, I don't know if this would be poor concrete. If a bridge lasts 75 years, is that really poor concrete or not? But this particular bridge was the original Highway 10 before they put in Highway 90. And if you look back on the original documents, they wanted 1,200 PSI concrete. Well, it lasted 75 years. What do you want out of this? So, in some cases, concrete will fall apart after time. So to understand a little bit about our deck program, you have to understand a little bit about how we rate our decks. So we take a deck and we break it up into kind of 3 elements. We'll look at the deck element itself. Maybe if it has an overlay on it, that will be a separate element. And then underneath the deck, we have the soffit as a separate element. And so what we do is, it's kind of different. When condition state 1 is basically the deck's okay. Condition state 2 is how much patching is on that deck. And so this isn't going to match up very well with the National Bridge Element definition, but we got cut back so much in how much testing we could do and things. We had to look for a creative way of figuring out how are our decks deteriorating. Well, we kind of know if maintenance is out there patching them, then that deck is deteriorating. So if we could quantify how much patching is on a deck, it would give us a lot of information on how to preserve or do asset management. So that's kind of what we do. Condition state 2 is patching, condition state 3 is spalling, and then we just use condition state 4 as a kind of throw in there for any deck testing. And so on this particular deck you're looking at in the picture, it had 26% patching over 1,000 square feet. So that gives us an indication from just looking this in a database or something, that we have an issue here, we have a lot of patching on this deck. Now, if you were to go back and look at that deck today, we had done a rehabilitation in 2013. You look at the top surface, everything looks great, there's no patching on it at all. You look at the soffit looks great, there's no cracking, there's no patching. So based on our system, you would look at those 3 elements, everything would be in condition state 1, and so the NBI deck code would be a 7, and so this deck would be in good condition until, again, it starts falling apart again and we get patches on it. So how do we relate that to an NBI code? Well, we look at the percentages, and if there's nothing wrong with the deck, then it would be in good condition, NBI 7 or above. If we start getting patches on that deck all the way up to 1%, then it would be a 6, NBI 6. Anywhere from 1% to 2%, it would be a 5. And then once we hit that 2% threshold, we drop it down to an NBI 4, and then 5% would go to a 3. This really helps us quantify and then gives us an indication from an asset management standpoint, how much do we have as far as a problem out there. And then if you like the deterioration curve, this is kind of where the curve fits. Good, fair, poor, based on those percentages, and then the years. And that it's really difficult to come up with an average deterioration curve for our inventory because we have a very broad spread, and I'll show that to you in a minute. So this is kind of the punchline from an asset management standpoint. What's the problem? What's the need? This is what we would show to legislature, governor, and everybody. So if you look for a past due for repair, that'd be 2% patching, 5% patching is past due, and due is 2%. You add those up, 85 bridges, $115 million worth of need right there. And then if you look at the next deterioration curve, service life, what's going to come up over the next 10 years, we have 223 bridges that need to be repaired for another $726 million. You add all that up, and it comes up to 310 bridges, $860 million for that 10-year period. You do the math, divide that by 10, you should be doing $86 million a year. We're currently funded for 10. So we have a big gap there, which means if you know a maintenance guy, throw him a thank you card every once in a while, because this is really going to be the new normal. Because if you have that big of a need where you're not out there preserving your bridge decks, then maintenance is actually going to have to hold these things together and patch them. So you're going to see, especially in Washington State, more patches, more maintenance guys out there fixing those bridges. So here's another way to look at our inventory, how to slice and dice it. We have bridges with just bare concrete with just what we call black steel, unreinforced or uncoated reinforced bars. And that represents about 19% of our inventory. And now, since the early 80s, we switched over to epoxy coating. So that's another slice. And then concrete overlays, where you can see a little bar up there of 20. We've actually went back and did 20 what we call second and third generations. They were originally a concrete overlay, and we've done them for a second or third time now. And then asphalt, polyester, and polymer. Another way of looking at this graph, if you put a line right in between the green and the gray, then you could see that basically half of our decks are uncoated without an overlay, and then the other half have an overlay on them. So another way that you can do that is let's just look at the bare decks with just unprotected, uncoated steel. So if you look at that and you look at the NBI code, there's 43 of those bridge decks that are currently in poor condition. Another 286 that are in fair condition, and then some good. So there's a big slice of this donut that could fall into that poor condition over time. And so if you look at the spread, the oldest bridge is 94 years, average age is 52 years, and then 25 bridges are over 75 years. So we've gotten a good spread there, good service life out of a lot of these decks. This particular bridge is up near a little town called Omak, and it's, now 94 years old. It's done its job, and we've not done anything to this deck to date. So it's done its job. There's been discussions about whether to replace this bridge or not, but I think the thought now is to preserve it and then build like a pedestrian bridge next to it. If you're ever up in that area, you want to go see a good cowboy stampede, the Omak Stampede, 84th Stampede this year. So another bridge deck is, maybe you've heard of in Seattle, is the Alaskan Way Viaduct. Okay, built in the 50s, is 65 years old. And so it was damaged in the Nisqually earthquake of 2001. Demolition is planned for 2019 when the tunnel gets done. So if you look at the details, it's got over 5,400 square feet of patching, but because its size is just barely on the fair side, it would almost be in the poor side. But because of other issues, the inspectors have put it in the poor condition classification. So now let's look at epoxy coated rebar in general. So we kind of have a history where all the way up to the late 70s we used uncoated rebar, and then in the late 70s and the early 80s we started using epoxy coated rebar in the top mat, and then in 2007 we did it in both mats. So we got a significant quantity of bridges now with epoxy coated rebar. Most of them are doing pretty well. We don't have any in poor condition. We do have a group now, 84 bridges in fair condition. And that's generally because some of the earlier generations epoxy coatings were really pretty thin. They actually started out as black, and then they went to brown, and then they went to green. But they improved the thickness a lot. So some of those early generations, not so good. Here's an example of that. One of the earliest one has now 270 square feet of patching. It would be in fair condition. But I expect this over the next 10 years to need some type of rehabilitation. And so the world's longest floating bridge happens to be in Washington State. We just opened a new one. You can kind of see it on the top side of the picture there. It's got all epoxy coated rebar in the deck and stuff. It replaced the old one that didn't. So that's kind of what's happening. As new bridges come online, they kind of replace some of the old ones. One of the things we've done in Washington State is we had a recipe mix for our concrete deck, and it was good for everything except for it had cracks on about a 2-foot spacing. So in 2010, we did a research just to see, hey, what's going on with our mix? So they did a bunch of mixes and said, yep, your concrete's good, but it cracks. So we decided to do a little bit different. We went to a performance-based mix. So now we have different performance categories that we want in our mix. And for each job, the contractor works with the concrete supplier and develops a mix. What happened is the cement paste came down. There's an admixture, crack-reducing admixture is in just about all of our mixes now. And the results are really good. On all our pre-stressed girder bridges, hardly any cracks. The steel bridges, we're still getting some cracks, so I think there's some room for improvement there. So concrete overlays. We've gone through a variety of types and styles, all the way from the first one that was installed in 1979. Then we did a kind of an Iowa low slump. There was a group of them that we did, about 35, and then the contractors really complained a lot that it was hard to mix and hard to work with and everything else, so we discontinued it, but most all of them are still in service. So we continued on with the latex until about 1987, when we introduced microsilica, and so then that came in. And then there was a kind of a shift where contractors really didn't want to use the mobile mixer trucks. They wanted ready mix trucks and plants. So we came up with a fly ash mix design. So then we had microsilica, fly ash, and latex. And then we tried rapid set, which for rapid curing and everything seems to work pretty well, except for we did have some issues with some cracking and some rutting, so we kind of discontinued its use. And then in 2016, this last year, we did something where we took our deck mix, and then on a couple of bridges where we had to go down to the rebar, we used our deck mix as a performance deck mix because we knew it was going to get less cracking. So we have a variety now of overlays, types there. They're all in our standard specifications. We allow the contractor to choose between latex, microsilica, and fly ash, but most common from all those is, at least in our state, is the fly ash mix. So if you look at the modified concrete overlays, there's a slice there, about 4% are in poor condition, about half are in fair condition, which means that half could easily switch into the poor condition. Average age, 26 years, the oldest, 38. So 187 bridges now are over 30 years. And this is kind of typical where you see some patches on that to preserve it. Here's an interesting bridge. This is called the Denny Creek Bridge. It's on I-90 if you're coming westbound from eastern Washington. It was a segmental post-tension box bridge that was built across this valley where they didn't want to do a bunch of stuff, shoring the bridge and everything, so they built it with gantries. Built in 1980, concrete overlay put on when the bridge was built. This is kind of the cross-section of it. Has pretty big wings on it, pretty big cantilevers on it that has post-tensioning. So we got some post-tensioning going on in this bridge. So we, have some deterioration going on. So it's a very touchy bridge. When you get into these type of bridges that have pre-stress and post-tensioning, you need to be very careful on what you're going to do and how you're going to do it when you rehabilitate it. What we're going to do is do a hydro mill to take off that overlay and then put a new concrete overlay on. So we got 6 of these segmental boxes. The Denny Creek was kind of the first one built before epoxy coated rebar. Again, these types of segmental boxes are very touchy, so as they deteriorate over time, you need to be aware of what your options are. This slide just kind of shows you a cross-section of where we're doing work now. Because we're in constrained budget, we're really focusing on I-90 and our main freight routes for which bridges we're doing. So when you get into asphalt overlays, we've got over 1,000 bridges with asphalt on them. This is kind of a typical paving train. You'll see the asphalt paver, and then you might see the shuttle buggy or this paving machine. That's the thing that we really become aware of is you can put a lot of weight on this machine, and not all our bridges are really load rated for this particular machine on 2 axles. So we're doing more load ratings and more considerations of this asphalt equipment on jobs. And then in some cases, we're kind of saying, no, you can't use this particular piece of equipment on a particular job. And we're kind of relearning asphalt on bridges again. We used to know how to do it really well, and now not so much. And so we're having to learn again what's the best way to pave asphalt, get the densities on our bridges. Asphalt removal, again, we're taking and paying attention to what kind of equipment, what type of bridge we have. Do we want to really use these big rotomills on certain types of bridges or not? So we're getting into a situation where we're requiring scraping of the asphalt. So we're not going to say means and methods, but we want a process that doesn't damage the bridge deck. Because all the reports come back to us, you use a rotomill on a bridge, you're going to grind into the bridge deck. And so here's an example of that. In the past, asphalt removal, rotary damage to the rebar, grooves in the deck, taking off the rebar cover that we want on there for deck protection. So we're going to, on bridges over 100 feet in length and certain bridges with integral bridge decks, we're going to require that those bridges the asphalt be scraped off. So here's a bridge. It was a pretty interesting bridge. It's kind of down near the Oregon border in our Tri-Cities, which is Richland, Pasco, Kennewick. This was the first cable-stayed bridge of its type in the United States. At the time it was built, it was the longest span. So a very unique bridge. It was combined with pre-stress segments. So a lot of bridges in Europe had used steel spans. This was a very unique bridge. Now we've got, it was, an asphalt overlay was put on from day one, and we are now getting into different cycles of removing that asphalt. So for 2 cycles, the first in '86 and then in '98, we didn't really specify how to remove the asphalt, so they used rotomills on it. And then this last time, we required them to scrape it off. So just to look at the bridge, it had these 300-ton segments that were barged in. They were match cast. They were put in. So again, very unique. And then we had pre-stressing in both directions. So it's something you really want to be careful of. You don't want to be damaging this bridge deck when you're doing your asphalt removal. And so here's a picture of how they did it this year. Kind of looks aggressive with this piece of equipment out there, but when you look at it all cleaned up, they didn't do any damage to the concrete. But we could see previous damage from the rotomill asphalt removal process from the previous cycles. And then here's another picture of them putting the membrane down. We did have some deterioration, some damage in those seams where these segments went together. So we want to prevent that in the future. We want to maintain this bridge as long as we can. And so as far as asphalt performance goes, we've had kind of recently some poor performance, and one of the reasons why is just density. We're not getting density, or when we get poor density, the disincentive for the contractor is not much. I mean, they get a small penalty, and then they keep the poor density asphalt on the bridge deck. So we need a balance there because we want to get, 10, 15 years of life out of this asphalt. It doesn't do any good if this only lasts 5 years. Polyester. So we've been doing polyesters since I think the mid-'80s. The average age is 20 years old. The oldest is 28. We got 23 bridges now with polyester. 3 of them are now in poor condition, with 4 in fair condition. And so there's been, over the time, there's been kind of just a migration of different types of equipment. This is one we did a few years ago with a company called Pinhall, who bought up Concrete Barrier, and then they're no longer in business. So I think with different types of equipment, the polyester has really changed and is a good product for deck overlays. We did a bridge in downtown Seattle, which is going northbound on I-5 in 2007, so it's 10 years. We specified, because of traffic and everything, I think we did this overlay in about 19 days. Pretty significant amount there, and everything's doing pretty well in it, just as about 300 square feet of spalls, but that's mostly around expansion joints. So we're doing a few polyester overlays this year. The main reason we're doing them is because in these segments of I-90, our region says the traffic volume doubles on the weekend. So it's kind of hard to start on Monday and try to get a concrete overlay done by Friday. So we're going back to doing polyesters, and if we're not done with the patching, we can turn the bridge back over to the traffic on the weekend, come back in on Monday, finish up on the patching, and then do the polyester overlay. So how do we measure success? One of those is by looking at how many deck replacements have you done. If you look at our system, we've done 16 bridges, full depth deck replacements in our history. So that, I don't know if that's shocking or not to you, but that's some state's yearly program. So we've done a pretty good job at preserving our bridge decks. One bridge deck that's being replaced and it's under contract now is the Umatilla Bridge. You can kind of see the steel truss in the foreground, and then there's a segmental box in the background. It's because, you know, we're kind of stuck with the horse we rode in on. If designer used a lightweight concrete in the past, we're kind of stuck with that. And what we found is over the Columbia River, both Oregon and Washington, designers, for whatever reasons, used a lot of lightweight concrete in their decks. We've also now found that they have about a 50-year expiration date. So about 50 years, you can expect these decks to pretty much fall apart. The only exception to that rule is our first Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And when it falls apart badly. And a combination of things that they used really very little rebar in this deck. And then the lightweight concrete just comes out in big chunks. So our maintenance guys are very happy that we have a project going this summer to replace this particular deck. We are going to use another lightweight deck, put a concrete overlay on it, but I think it'll perform pretty well that way. So again, you know, if you did some type of kind of a back of a napkin type estimate, if you look at our bridge deck system and then you just said, well, what if we didn't preserve our decks and we replaced them? Well, if you took half of our concrete, the ones we put concrete overlays on them, about 15 million square feet, and then you divide that by 2 and just said, hey, well, we had to replace 2, the cost differential would have been about over $1 billion. So technically, you know, I don't know what that percentage is. Maybe you could half this by a quarter, or maybe this is right or not. But by preserving our decks over time, we have saved a lot of money. And that's the main goal, is to save money, preserve our inventory as much as we can. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, our bridge deck program.
Dewayne, when you said you guys come up with an MBI rating of 3 if you have over 5% patching,
Right.
how did you come up with that? Is that based on problems you've seen with bridges greater than 5% patching, or just kind of curious?
Well, over time, we just learned that at that stage, we know we're out of maintenance and we're into preservation. And so we want to make sure that the system recognizes that those bridges are in poor condition and we need to take an action. And so we found, even if you take now a deterioration curve, that 5% is going to accelerate pretty rapidly. Within a few years, you could be up to 7 and 10%. If you don't get on that deck and preserve it fast, it will get into a deck replacement. And so it's a way of us kind of quantifying it. You know, and it's not something every state does, but it's just something that we found worked for us.